of you. Welcome to the conference Human Rights in an Unequal World for the doctorate program at Los Andes Law School, directed by Eleonora Lozano, and the Master of Laws, headed by me, Antonio Barreto. Is truly honored to have with us the very well-known Professor Samuel Moyn with us. Professor Moyn, he is a professor of jurisprudence at Yale Law School and professor of history at Yale University. He has many books delving into the history, meaning, and challenges of human rights, such as The Last Utopia and Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World, which is the name of this conference. Commenting, Professor Moyn will have Professor Jorge González Jácome. He is associate professor at Los Andes Law School, expert in constitutional law and legal history in Colombia and Latin America. We were supposed to have Professor Moyn in person here in Bogota, but the pandemic didn't let us. So let's say that life is unfair, but not that unfair, because we have him online. So it's a truly honor to have you, Professor Moyn. Thank you very much to you and to Professor González for organizing this, for being here with us, and to you all. So, okay, the format of the event will be as follows. The conference and main issues outlined by Professor Moyn will be combined with a sort of interview led by Professor González, who has a bunch of questions prepared by an academic group headed by him. So that'll take us around 1 hour, maybe a little bit more, but 1 hour with this format combining the conference and the interview. Then we'll open the floor to questions collected on the chat. So please make your questions on the chat of this conference. The public may ask questions either in Spanish or in English for the last half an hour. So, okay, we'll no further introductions and clarifications. I pass on the word on to Professor Moyn. You go first, right, Professor Moyn? So please go on. Or would you like to say something, Jorge?
Yeah, I think we'll start with the conversation. Thank you, Antonio, and thank you to you, and thank you, Sam, for being online. It was our second best shot to have you in some sort of conversation on what was supposed to be a tour around Latin America, but possible. So thanks so much for agreeing to have this conversation online. So we are also benefited with this format because we have many people participating in this conference. So Sam, thanks a lot. So we will start trying to build up on a conversation that perhaps can make many people, can motivate many people also to ask questions on the chat. So one of the most interesting things about your work, Sam, is that you've evolved in the ways in which you've reached, or the way in which you've delved into the human rights history, and that has evolved during time. So the first thing that maybe I wanted to ask you, and we wanted to ask you, is how did you end up writing the history of human rights? Why did you feel that that was a field worth pursuing when you wrote The Last Utopia, and maybe things that went before? And how has that field evolved after The Last Utopia, and how that evolution led you to Not Enough, almost a decade later? And how are you assessing the field now with all your work?
Well, so to begin with, I see someone in the chat as saying that there may be some difficulty with others joining the event. I just want to begin by thanking everyone, notably Antonio and Jorge. I can't wait come back to Colombia, and I hope it will happen soon.
That'll be great.
It was one of my favorite trips in life, and I'm enormously grateful. It's an honor to be part of this event and to have your attention and to learn from you. So Jorge, I'll just begin by saying I'm an amateur. I like to try to begin conversations and hope that I can learn something from them. And mainly, I started that attempt to talk about where human rights came from because I didn't see the conversation exactly there when I first decided to write about it. My motivation was that I was a young person in the 1990s, and for us, we'll talk later about people who are situated in different places on the globe, but certainly for those of us young United States citizens in the 1990s, it wasn't just that we were told that history had ended, but that human rights were at the end of the road with, a little bit left to do to spread them to places that hadn't accepted them yet. Notably when there were atrocities taking place. And we didn't hear a lot about topics like empire and power, or to come to the theme of not enough, about distribution and economics. It was just assumed that we discovered the formula of human flourishing in a version of the American system which had prevailed in the Cold War, and human rights were a kind of internationalized version of that formula. And when I was young, I believed it all. I mean, I was like any student. I listened to my teachers and my elders and betters, and it was only, let's say, after the Iraq War in 2003 that I began to wonder if the history of human rights, which I had begun teaching as a young professor, were not just leading to the end of history, but to other destinations. And I think, obviously, they did, and they still are leading to different destinations. So in 2008 and 2009, I decided to write a book about the history of human rights. There really weren't any. I suppose you could say there were one or two, but they tended to kind of ratify the consensus of the 1990s, that human rights came from a long time ago. They were Enlightenment principles associated with the European discovery of reason after the reign of religion. And they faced a battle to be accepted. But after World War II and the Holocaust, people realized they really had to be accepted just because they were necessary points of orientation morally, and legal projects flowed from that moment of the 1940s, especially the concern about atrocity, given the Nuremberg trials as they were presented then, and the Genocide Convention. And maybe the Cold War interrupted things, but in the 90s, human rights were finally embraced by all as they deserved to be embraced. And that was basically the narrative. And I began to think that this couldn't be true because even before I wrote Not Enough, it was clear that the victory of human rights at the end of the Cold War masked global hierarchy, with some set of states, especially global southern states, that had once been under the imperial control of northern states, still had to catch up and kind of get with the program of human rights. And then there was war, which probably motivated me more than anything in The Last Utopia, which was published in 2010, that even though just on its face, the United Nations Charter in 1945 prioritizes control of force in the international system. That's its purpose. Somehow now wars were being fought in the name of human rights, which I think, was as much a betrayal of the legacy of the 1940s as a realization. So I did write this book, and The Last Utopia, and the funny thing was that I wrote it very quickly in 1 year, which I tend to do. I can't, when I'm teaching, I can't have the time to write. So if I get time off from teaching, I try to, work hard. So that year I had off was 2008-9. And of course, right then, what was happening? This massive global economic dislocation. But somehow I was, I missed it. I didn't register, trying to register the Iraq War 5 years earlier. I didn't register what was going on. Now I was in my defense, I was in this garden of Princeton, New Jersey, where probably you learn about things much later than if you're experiencing the shocks as a poor person or someone in a precarious situation. But anyway, over the following 10 years, I just felt I could write another book that did a better job with, as I said before, distribution and political economy. And that meant I wanted to focus much more than I had on the history of economic and social rights and how they connected. So I'm sure we'll talk about, what I try to argue and the limitations of what I try to argue. I'll just, just to keep this answer on, the less long side, since it's already not brief, I'll just say, I like to say I've retired from the history of human rights because, it's an exciting field, and the best thing about being an author is to see your work overturned. I've always thought that. And you start a conversation, but you don't, control it. Why would you want to do so if you're an interlocutor? The best thing is to be contradicted. Now, that doesn't mean I always accept that I've been proven wrong about my speculation, but I'm very happy to, to acknowledge the severe limitations of really both of these books that you've painfully translated. Thank you for doing that too.
That's great. It's very interesting how you connect with also this generational idea about The Last Utopia. I think that motivates us a lot to think about how different generations address problems. And you were mentioning that 2008, 2009, actually, when you were writing The Last Utopia, it was like the economic downturn. So you came to Not Enough pretty much thinking about that. And maybe we can delve a little bit more in Not Enough. There are like two categories in Not Enough that are around the book that are sufficiency and equality, right? Like sufficiency meaning more about giving the minimums for people to actually live, and equality perhaps more like in a distributional idea of trying to set limits on ceilings and not only actually floors. How do you envision this relationship through history and not enough, like the relationship between sufficiency and equality? Because actually some people have raised that you seem to argue in Not Enough that equality is like a moral principle even more important than sufficiency, perhaps. But I would like to know more, and maybe would like to know more about how's that relationship traced in Not Enough.
Good. It's an excellent question. So, fast forwarding to the year when I wasn't teaching, when I wrote Not Enough, which I think must have been 2016, 17. By this point, the toll of the economic crisis was very clear, and it seemed obvious with the election of Donald Trump in my country, which happened while I was writing Not Enough, and with lots of other events around the world which I was following, that it would be interesting to rethink the relation of how human rights were talked about over time and institutionalized with the history of political economy, which lots of historians began to write about after 2008. We should also mention the blockbuster success just before I framed Not Enough of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. And I want to talk about this later, but we could engage how to write about the history of political economy in many ways. I engaged it by thinking about the distributional ethics by which we can imagine and judge the way we set up our systems of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. You could think about it in many other ways. You could track how much power people get in political economy. But I chose to focus on distributional principles. And because the problem of inequality was already so obvious, but was now much more mainstream because of Piketty, I chose to think about whether international human rights and domestic human rights before them and alongside them are egalitarian at all. I mean, I thought it was an interesting question, because the moment we ask it, we begin to think, well, what does the history of human rights have to do with the history of the rise and fall of the ambition to live in more rather than less egalitarian circumstances? Now, I just mentioned briefly, because we may come back to this too, that when I say I'm interested in distributional equality, I'm distinguishing that both from sufficiency, which I'll get to, but also from status equality. So when I think about distributional equality, the basic question is, how much of the good things in life do people get, and is that distribution more or less equal? Status equality concerns whether people are treated equally no matter what kind of people they are. If they are one race rather than another, one gender rather than another, one sexual orientation rather than another, indigenous or disabled rather than not. And we should talk about status equality probably, but mainly I'm interested in the contrast between these two distributional principles. So sufficiency, as you say, means that we are interested morally. What matters morally is whether individuals get enough of the good things in life. And that is a different question from whether they're relatively more or less equal to one another. And you could imagine that the more of the good things in life people have relative to some line or threshold, they will be more equal to those above the line than when they had been below it. But it was very clear to me that this wasn't necessarily the case. And indeed, I wanted to make the point of my book that we can say there's like a hallmark or signature to the political economy of our age in many places at the domestic or national level, which is that the poor are less poor, but the rich increase their gains relative to the rest. These two things happen simultaneously. And that means that if we just track where people are relative to some line or threshold, do they have enough food? Do they have a house? Do they have adequate sanitation? Do they have healthcare or access to it? Then we might not ask where the rest are relative to the rich. The one question doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other. So this seemed to me to have, I think, earth-shattering implications for how we should think about the history of human rights, because we don't just have to ask how it became imaginable that people could say they have a right to food or housing or healthcare, but whether or not they get it, whether they're gaining or falling back in relation to the rich. Are they getting sufficiency as equality increases or decreases? And so I wanted to frame my whole book around this question. And just briefly, I followed the historians of political economy in identifying three big modern ages of political economy, both at the local or national and at the global level. The first was, let's call it the classical liberal age of the 19th century through the early 20th century, with a strong push for a deregulated market with minimal government interference, which included the disruption of older moral constraints that had existed in the way people organized their economic lives. And my basic claim was that in this first stage, people didn't get enough of the good things in life, and they became more unequal within their societies at the same time. And that meant that if there were economic and social rights propounded, they weren't realized because the poor didn't always get better off. And the rich also increased their gains. So it was like a terrible thing on both sides of the equation of sufficiency and equality. Then the second stage came, which I'll just generalize. I know we'll get to this as the welfare age. And the welfare age was pursued by lots of different kinds of government, democratic and non-democratic, like communist and fascist. And in this age, we can say it was the great age of the canonization of economic and social rights, including in Latin American constitutions, but also in European constitutions. And even my, hyper-liberal country, which stresses economic freedom for most of its history, has some gestures towards a welfare state. So in this period, what happens? Well, there's some spotty but real progress around sufficiency. More people get out of poverty than in the 19th century and get these basic minimums honored. But the big event compared to the era before and the era since is that inequality contracts at the national level. And that's something that I think we need to take very seriously. Now, in the third stage, which is, let's say, our time, I want to tell a kind of, tragic story. On the one hand, the global South decolonizes, and the number of states, triples or quadruples as a result. And the story I tell in Not Enough is that the main actors of the global South didn't demand human rights, even rights to sufficient provision, because they prioritized egalitarian distribution much more rhetorically. And they invent something that no one before had proposed, which was the idea of global egalitarian distribution, remedying the gap that was increasing after World War II between the global rich and the global rest. But instead of their project, what we call neoliberalism won. So the last age I'm calling not the age of the welfare state, but the age of neoliberal globalization. And the basic argument is that this is not like the 19th century, because in many places in our neoliberal age, the poor have gotten less poor. And in effect, they've had some of their economic and social rights vindicated. Now, there's a huge debate, and we have to have it, about who vindicated those rights. And in Latin America, did courts play a big role, and so forth. But my main observation is that even though the poor got better off, unlike in the 19th century, but like in the middle of the 20th century, the rich won very big in the neoliberal era, and inequality increased at the national level. And that is like the 19th century, but unlike the middle welfare state era. And so I draw some moral lessons from this. It's not that I think equality is more important than sufficiency. I never say such a thing, unless I did and you translated it more recently than I wrote it. I just think we should recognize that the age in which human rights, especially international human rights, have been taken more seriously is also the age of the victory of the rich. And that means we have to judge human rights as being part of that age and decide, how to respond.
That's great. I think that you touch upon like several issues, both theoretically about the relationship between political economy and law and human rights, and also about like let's call it like the historiographical punchline of the book. So I would like to ask you a couple of questions about those two things. So like in the first realm, and I noticed that some people might have asked this on the chat, it's like, what's the relationship between so this is fascinating about saying that you can write a history of political economy through human rights in a way, and that is what we understand that Not Enough might be doing as well, like how to get that. But at the same time, this gives like some uneasiness to some human rights activists, perhaps, at the idea that, well, are human rights always reflecting the political economy of the time? Therefore, they are not a place where you can actually change, for instance, the distributional arrangements that there are in a society. Do you think that that's the point? That would like the first line of things that we might talk about? And the
Absolutely.
second one,
It's a
and
great
the second
question.
one, more specifically, in the historiographical realm, like, and this has been a huge debate and around the book, is about how's that global South in the book portrayed, right? And one of the things that you mentioned in those three periods, it's actually, I would like to push you on the idea about welfare, or its welfare state, or welfarism, in contrast to neoliberalism. So For example, when you look at Latin America, you find this debates about developmentalism that you touch upon in the book, actually. Prebisch appears in your book and how he was making all this ideas for the SILA, etc. Do you think that developmentalism is part of welfarism, or does it have like different characteristics? Because actually, when one thinks about the welfare state, one might think more in the Northern European or U.S. debates, and we think more about developmentalism, which is there in your book,
Yes.
but I don't know how you fit that picture in that global history.
That's a fantastic question, but I should start with the first. So this is a non-Marxist book theoretically, but it seems as if there are some things that we typically associate with Marx that I accept, and that's because I think every serious attempt at social theory before and after Marx has insisted that political economy is a very powerful thing and it affects everything else. So typically that's discussed in Marx's terms of the relation of a base to a superstructure. But actually from Montesquieu to the present, everyone has to agree that how a society organizes production, exchange, distribution, consumption, what I'm calling political economy, bears on everything else powerfully. And it even determines what people imagine to be a reform worth pursuing. So again, we can't deny as historians that in modern societies especially, the way we organize these very basic things about our relationships to one another and our interdependence even have an effect on how we believe we ought to change those things. So it's absolutely true that I don't think you can write a history of human rights like in a void, as if it's just a story of moral or legal doctrines, because that would ignore that human rights, like all of us, like all of our ideas, are hostage to how we decide to organize our political economy. And I think it's undeniable that the history of human rights tracks the history of political economy very precisely. In the 19th century, the main human rights of significance, in law especially, were freedom of contract and the sanctity of private property. I think Marx was dead on as a matter of historical fact when he assumed that rights could never be about anything else, because that's what they were about when he was living. If we're honest, that's just the truth. But then when we look in the welfare state era, it turns out that the state can intervene, can rearrange political economy in the service of different outcomes, and the meaning of rights can change, notably through the canonization of economic and social rights. And then again in our neoliberal age, once again, I think you can say without any controversy that we have to understand how our beliefs in human rights and the practices we organize around them are in some sense hostage to the larger decisions we've made about how to live together economically. Now, that doesn't mean that human rights can't change those arrangements. But certainly we can only understand that activism while acknowledging that human rights are also shaped by the political economy they may try to reform. So, development, especially in Latin American welfare experience, is a kind of blind spot in the book. I mean, I have to acknowledge that straight out. I mean, I think I did a much better job in the book with Africa than Latin America, for various reasons of choice and ignorance. And I definitely talk about the history of development, but it's primarily international development and the project of launching states that have been more recently under colonialism. So, I think it's a fascinating thing to think about how we should get at the specificity of the Latin American experience in all of my stages. And you're certainly right that even if Latin America isn't off on its own, like its own unique, everything's unique and has some similarities with other places. You're clearly right to say that welfare state development has a different trajectory, and I'd argue Latin America also has a very distinctive trajectory in the era of neoliberalism because of its actually kind of unprecedented pink wave that happens nowhere else in the world, to the best of my limited knowledge. So in both of these phases, the more developmentalist one and later, we definitely should attend. I will just close by saying, we shouldn't understate even how poor the poor were in the rich countries before the coming of the welfare state, and how much development was seen as necessary and as an intentional project there too. And a classic example would be the Tennessee Valley Authority in my country, where New Dealers basically treated the middle of the country where I'm from as like savage Africa that needed to be, redeemed by enlightened administrators from, the coasts and from Harvard University and so forth. But of course, it's true that this dynamic was much more pronounced in south of the U.S. border.
Also, I mean, perhaps connecting on that. So one of your arguments is that human rights are like this powerless companion, as you mentioned, to neoliberalism.
Yes.
Like the idea that human rights activism are this powerless companion who cannot do much about the inequalities built by a neoliberal political economy. However, I read a recent interview that you have with Jacobin magazine, right, in which you talk a little bit about different ways in which actually rights might have been understood. And actually, I think that many people might be interested in this about social rights and social and economic rights. I mean, so the point is that we right now think about social and economic rights in the verge of constitutionalism, perhaps, and human rights activism of the post-war. But what you mentioned in that interview back then was also that, and that's also that something appears in the book, is something about some idea of social rights that perhaps were different within the welfare period, or perhaps on a different type of internationalism that didn't have the United Nations at the center, but actually I think the International Labor Organization, for example. So this makes you wonder about, and you were mentioning this in the last answer, about how we can think on different types of rights activism and which types of rights activism are actually possible today and which are not, right? So I wanted to push you a little bit on that, if you can tell us something about that, because, for example, there's this fantastic review in which Mark Goodell, I think in the Boston Review, reviews both your book and Kathleen Sickling's book about Evidence for Hope. And he says something about that, about perhaps not about rights activism, but about how there has been some ways of curbing inequality. He talks about Bolivia, for instance, talking about Latin American pink wave, etc., in which maybe you might find other types, you can say, about rights activism or other ideas about rights that are not connected to the neoliberal political economy.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm curious about how do you envision like possibilities for rights,
Yes.
both contemporary and actually in options that were not taken in the past, which is something that you proposed really well.
Good. So, just abstractly, as I said in the prior answer, even though I take the kind of force that political economy exercises over us and our reform ideas very seriously, ultimately I appeal to human freedom, and people can make of rights or try to different things than they were before, and that could happen in theory anytime. In the book, in the early history of social rights, I do emphasize that even some of the earliest social rights were about sufficiency, like the right to work is propounded mainly to get workers in misery over some threshold of provision. But from very early, economic and social rights can also be framed differently as about power, including the power to exact more egalitarian concessions. So the classical examples would be labor rights, especially not ones concerning the state of the workplace, but rather the rights to organize and strike, which I do try to detail very carefully, because the right to strike in particular has been so contentious in the history of constitution making and in treaties as well, in the negotiation of treaties. And if we think for a minute, we can see how different those rights are from the economic and social rights that are typically given pride of place in the contemporary human rights imagination, which are really sufficiency rights or welfare rights, to a sufficient amount of some good, like the ones I was mentioning before, food or health or whatever. It's not that those other rights, the rights to organize and strike, don't bear on egalitarian distribution, but they do because they're about the allocation of power to workers. And those rights never went away, obviously. They had their high point both imaginatively and organizationally in the welfare era. And if we want to know why it was that era was comparatively egalitarian in outcome, it's because those rights mattered much more than before or since. Now, it does follow that if we imagined a human rights movement today that were more about those rights, labor rights, we could imagine different outcomes. Now, a couple of small provisos about this. One is about the ILO, the International Labor Organization. There's no cause to celebrate it because, it was many different things over its history. And I would say not great over its history, but it is true that in certain circumstances, it has prioritized the rights to organize and strike. But the second proviso would be that kind of one of the really big issues of our time in many places is not just the divergence between the rich and the rest, but the conflict of interest between the working class and those who are even poorer. One way of interpreting this signature development of our time, where I said the poor are getting better, less poor, and the rich are doing best, is as an alliance of the rich and the poor against the middle. But that means that labor rights, which could be about arguing on behalf of a broad middle class could lead to certain divergence from the kinds of concern with the very worst off that human rights, especially distributional human rights like housing, campaigns, and so forth, have become about. So I think it would be very exciting to imagine a more ambitious human rights movement, but it wouldn't be without its difficulties, including this difficulty of opposing the rich while making sure to unite the middle and the bottom without separating them from one another.
I would like to move to another issue is about, and I know that there are many people perhaps that are writing their projects in legal history and or international law. So I had like a couple of questions around that, and those and some of them have been raised by other people when they talk about your book, but I want to raise it in a slightly different way. So the first one, when you write history, in a way, when you're in this idea of writing the history of international law, or perhaps global history, if you would like to pigeonhole it like that, or even at some point, well, you're always going to be the object of being charged as you were biased and you excluded, right? So the bias and exclusion is something that always appears when we write about legal history. And if you write about international, where's the national? And if you write about national legal history, where's the regional, or whatever? But I want to, instead of raising that question about, well, you're not considering actually the experience of this in this country, which is generally how that argument appears.
Yes.
I know that when you write, you make like some conscious exclusions, right? When you write your book, you probably you research something, you find this archive, but you're not able to fit it in the book, right? To put it there. And then when you publish it and when the discussion goes on, there's some exclusions that you say, well, I wasn't conscious about that. So there are like types of exclusions. So I wanted to ask you about your experience on that, on those two levels, like things that perhaps you found, but you weren't able to include here. And sometimes you really say like, well, this is a pity that I wasn't able to do that. So that's, yeah, I think I'll stop there maybe to listen to your
It's no, I mean, it's a very hard question because, you know, we should note the bias and exclusion of everyone whom we read, but without pretending that that we are not ourselves subject to selectivity. Anytime we do anything, we're not doing something else, and there's no way to be comprehensive. And so the question is, how do we own the omissions of which we're conscious, and then acknowledge those of which we're not conscious when they're pointed out. So absolutely. I mean, no book, even one that, merely purports to cover a couple of thousand years across the world, cannot have massive blind spots. But to decide how, so let's just acknowledge that my book is probably weakest. I think I already did acknowledge this with respect to certain Latin American jurisdictions. In part, that's because I think the historical literature to which I had access was not that advanced. And also, there are lots of debates among scholars about the contemporary period. So, if we want to talk about Colombia, well, there's a debate in the literature. And if you take a side in that debate and then say someone ignored your country, you're not really being honest. So, I did have an exchange with a very important academic and judge who's Colombian, and it kind of amazed me that even while I absolutely didn't do justice to the experience of your country, it's shocking that it wouldn't be worth considering, well, how do these arguments fit with its history, including the fact that I believe it's the most in the most unequal region in the world, and is the second most unequal country in that region. And so if we want to claim that we've seen remarkable successes, say in judicial enforcement of economic and social rights in in a particular country, we have to ask, well, what's the relation between that fact and the history of its domestic inequalities? I guess I'd say, it's so important to have books overturned, and my take would be that's a desirable event. And the question is, do we overturn our books by providing a different framework, or by showing in different locations that a kind of general narrative doesn't work? I think it's both. I think we can't rest content with our discussion if we just have local corrections, because then we don't know what the big picture is in the end. So I would say, our discussions are best advanced by a combination of local inquiry and objection as well as global rethinking. And, that's the most exciting thing about being a scholar, is that we work together to, get rid of the bad books and write better ones, and which in turn become bad in time.
Yes. So this actually connects with one question also I want to ask you about critique in general, like critique as a project, perhaps in your book, and how do you think that your work, both in Last Utopia and Not Enough, is a work of critique? So, for example, like I know that you've mentioned that this is not actually like critical legal history in the vein of critical legal studies, and it doesn't feel like that completely. But it does feel also as a way of doing this critiquing, actually in revealing structures that were perhaps hidden or unearthing something like that. So what's the purpose of your critique? How do you envision your critique? First time I read your book, I felt nostalgia for welfare state, but then I read it closely, and you were mentioning the Tennessee Valley Authority and how that also sounds very colonial within the U.S. Yes. And actually, yes, there are some points in which there is some nostalgia and some melancholic take on that. So, and I think that critique is also like this aesthetic proposal of raising some types of emotions in your readers as well. So I was curious about, how do you feel yourself in this critical tradition? What's your role as a critic? Do you describe yourself as such, or in the field of international law or international human rights?
Right. Well, first off, I don't consider myself in the field of the history of law. I'm writing a book now. I'm off this year, so I got to write another one, which is, in my opinion, my first book that has been about law. But neither The Last Utopia nor Not Enough is, except in a subsidiary way. But I definitely intend myself to be a critic of some kind. I think I moved from a more of a kind of follower of a kind of combination of Hannah Arendt and Michel Foucault in The Last Utopia to a much more mainstream kind of like welfarist in Not Enough, as if the normative criteria that philosophers have highlighted, including their contrast between sufficiency and equality, matter. But I'm still deeply critical in a way they're not typically of human rights as an idea and movement. And, for that I remain unapologetic. If we imagine not that long ago, someone writing a critical history of the Roman Catholic Church, we can imagine our priest who, taught us, what we know as boys and girls, saying, how could you attack the church? It's, for all its flaws, it's the representative of God on earth. And I think some of us would take that objection seriously if we're in the church. But if we're not, we would say, well, it's just another human institution. This one has lasted a long time. but not all human institutions deserve to last, and they are works in progress, just like each individual, and certainly myself. So I always came to human rights and the human rights movement as someone who felt entitled to say, you are just one thing in history and not the first or the last. And therefore we can decide whether to keep you around, which I advocate, and what else to hope for. And so I know that I've elicited the objection by people like Catherine Sicking, whom you mentioned, that it's really not allowed to be critical. But I think that's mainly because she and others who make that observation have a relationship to human rights like we might have, to the church. And I don't kind of adopt those criteria. So I would say I'm a part of the critical tradition. I think I'm pursuing it in a slightly different way, and definitely not as a theorist of critique as of now. But I think ultimately we each do need a theory of our own practice. Historians are notorious for being, not interested in theory, but then they just enact a theory that they may not have thought much about. So I think even if we're historians, we have to kind of have our own theory of what we're doing. And that's true because it's true of us as human beings. If we're not thinking, how should I live? Then we're not living well. I mean, I believe Socrates said that many years ago.
Guys, can I jump in? Sure, it's been a fascinating dialogue, that of the two of you. So I have many questions here on the chat. So what do you want to do? Do you want to, Jorge, you have more questions for Professor Moyn, or would you like to take some questions from the chat? Jorge, or
Yes.
good? Professor Moyn, agree?
Yeah, I think I'm very happy to move to the chat now.
Okay. Sure, on the chat, there are many questions dealing with human rights, history as a change agent, questions dealing with SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, questions dealing with how about if we talk this from the institutional point of view, how it's what is the relationship between human rights and cosmopolitanism, etc. So there are many issues. So could we start with the SDGs issue on the chat? They say that let's better talk about the SDGs, such as zero hunger or clean water or sanitation. So what do you think about that, Professor Moyn?
Yeah, I did see that question, which is a very interesting one. So my book, it's kind of funny. The book does try to cover 2,000 years with an emphasis on the last 200. But a lot of the debates have clustered in what I say about the last 10 years, which is only, a few of the pages at the very end of the book. And although in those pages I mention the Sustainable Development Goals, because what's very interesting about those, norms is that they are mainly calls for improvements in global sufficiency. But there's also one, I believe it's SDG 10, that has an egalitarian content. I think I would start within the framework of my book by contrasting the SDGs with the earlier calls in development for a kind of focus on global equality. And we tend to think that international standards get stronger and stronger, and that's true if we start from the Millennium Development Goals and compare them to the Sustainable Development Goals. But in regards to equality, they've gotten weaker. So you could have a story where in the 1970s, the Global South, including people like Raul Prebisch, are behind an emerging norm of global equalization of states. That concern is completely left out of the Millennium Development Goals and then restored in a very modest and vague way in the Sustainable Development Goals. And what does this tell us? It doesn't tell us that the rest of the goals are bad, because they focus often on sufficiency and many other things, because the SDGs, I think, are guilty of having a kind of, what we would call in English, a kind of kitchen sink approach. Like everything that anyone wants is in them. And yet this goal I'm concerned about of retrieving equality at the national and global level from the wreckage of the neoliberal era, it's there only partly. And there's very good scholarship I cite in the book by Kate Donald and others on the prospects of the SDGs in general and on the egalitarian front. So I think we're obviously in early days in figuring out what the SDGs will mean in real life and over time. They're like so many other, international enterprises. They're noble, but they really depend on, so many political kind of debates and on mobilization to make sure that at least some of them are put into practice, including this one, SDG 10, on equality.
Okay. You mentioned the Global South, Professor Moyn, and that's another bunch of questions about the South and North dialogue.
Yeah.
So it could be, or is the human rights history also one of the 9 abuses against the Global South? What do you think? What do you say about that? Could we say that human rights law is an instrument for emancipation, or at least for transformation of our reality?
Yes.
Ask some of the attendees.
Good. So let me start with the second kind of part of the question. Mm-hmm. I'm not someone who writes about bad people and evil politics. A lot of people are interested in those things, but I've always been interested in the different ways that good can be pursued, and the choices that good people make, because there's never just one choice. And it also is the fact that emancipation does not mean one thing. It has different possible directions. And the point of my book is to say emancipation could mean more sufficiency or more equality. And it's the hallmark of our time that these two things are not going together. So in regards to the Global South, what is, I think, very important is that human rights movements and law are often oriented to the greater suffering of the Global South. And so they're about emancipation of the Global South in that sense. They're, however, oriented to individuals in the Global South as individuals. What they're not oriented towards is always, or really often, is the interstate order. The whole idea of a North-South dialogue and North-South relations emerged as a debate about the relation of the wealthy states of the global north to the poor states, or poorer states of the global south. And one of the main purposes of my book is to point out that human rights are not directly about that debate. And we can have some good examples of this if we take economic and social rights in the second covenant for human rights, the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There is no obligation really, unless we kind of interpret that treaty very creatively, that obligates the citizens of the global north to fulfill the economic and social rights of the citizens of the global south. But in a way, that's the main disparity in the world. And so human rights, I think, are not emancipatory when it comes to that challenge. It is sad that even our most ambitious human rights in that second covenant are about poor states and their obligation to service their own poor. That is what human rights law seems to be about. And that, to me, that's outrageous, because a central feature of emancipation ought to be the emancipation of the global south relative to the global north. And human rights law is to date not about that emancipation. It's about a different emancipation, which is also worth pursuing. So I think this is a great question, and it's a question that is one that's closest to my heart in writing this book.
Yeah, Sam, there are also some questions in the chat about not only thinking about the past, but actually thinking about the present and the future, perhaps, and how do you envision what's going to happen with perhaps inequality and human rights, or sufficiency and inequality, vis-a-vis some contemporary issues. For example, one of them is the Anthropocene or climate change. Do you see envisioning something different going out from there? The other one, you could also talk about maybe the pandemic, and how the pandemic is going to push upon inequality, and then the reaction is going to be like more human rights about sufficiency, and you see that in basic rent, perhaps, and that also is something that we might be concerned, because many people are saying like, well, after this, Trump, Bolsonaro, I don't know, and Boris Johnson are out because they're not doing a very good job. But maybe one can be skeptic about that thing, because if inequality triggered populism, right, and the pandemic is going to trigger more inequality, well, maybe populism is not out of the picture. So there are like some set of contemporary challenges that you might think about: climate change, populism, and pandemic, and maybe perhaps growing protests like Black Lives Matter, or the protests last year in Latin America. So there's like this global things going on, and I know you've written a lot about this on different op-eds, etc. And you might have like some clues that they're about this issue that some people also are asking.
Good. No, those are fantastic questions, and they are just way too huge to deal with in one answer. So I'm going to pick and choose. The truth is that this book was written in a kind of interregnum, as we would now see it. It was after 2008, with some descent to neoliberalism coming, but nothing compared to the period in which we're living now, with populist clash in many more places than before. So the book does not at all provide guidance on new crises, not just of populism, but of ongoing ecological degradation, or now the pandemic. I guess what I would say is that there's a kind of that some of these crises reveal some limits to the book, while they also might help us retrieve certain lessons from the book at the same time. So when we think about an event like the pandemic or the victims of populism or of ecological degradation, we unsurprisingly find that the worst off bear the brunt of all crises in human history. They're not equally bad for all people in societies, but instead the rich can typically immunize themselves to things like ecological change or a global pandemic, or in the case of populism, actually participate in the rise of populism, because populism sometimes serves the interest of the rich. In my country, just to take an example, Donald Trump has succeeded in very little in policy except for cutting the taxes of the rich. So in a way, I think it's hard to emerge from thinking about these crises without forcing us to embrace the importance of sufficient provision and cushioning the worst off against the shocks of these crises. How could anyone except the hard-hearted conclude otherwise that sufficiency matters? But I would also add that I believe especially populism is reminding us that figuring out how to balance sufficiency and equality is ultimately what matters. So here's what I have in mind. If we ask historically and in today's world, what are the conditions under which citizens take care of one another, including honor the economic and social rights of the worst off? Well, it's when they feel that they're part of a common enterprise. And the populist revolts, I think, have been happening because that sense of commonality has just suffered, with the rich living in a way in a secondary society compared to the rest of us. And what that means is that the fate of the worst off, the human rights, the sufficient provision for the poor, turns out to be hostage to what the majority wants. And if they choose backlash and they choose politicians who hurt the poor, it's the poor who suffer most, and it's sufficient provision that turns out to be the main victim of the crisis of equality. So I think that means that we just need a more ambitious movement in the face of these crises than human rights. It's not that human rights don't matter. They matter more than ever. But we also need to create the conditions for a fairer community in which people feel that they're in the same enterprise. And that would require us to bring the rich down and make the middle feel like it's stagnating less, so that it doesn't choose some of the terrible politicians that the majority has chosen lately.
Talking about Trump, Bolsonaro, the rise of populism, Professor Moyn, one of the attendees asked how democratic nations should rethink human rights, or at least the human rights agenda. So what would you think about that?
So I'll just extend my last answer because that's my answer. That okay. In places where we have good enough functioning democracies, since of course no democracy is really democratic yet, I think we have to emphasize the supplementation of the human rights agenda by one that focuses on the middle class and its fate. And so it goes back to my answer to Jorge that we have to somehow pursue human rights while connecting them to a more ambitious politics for everyone, and notably the middle class. And the real debate is how much does it fall on advocates of human rights to figure out how to make that compromise? I have been, very much criticized for denying that human rights activists in particular should do much more than they're already trying and failing to do. A lot of people read my book and say, no problem. Either human rights organizations are already pursuing equality successfully, or they can do so easily. And that just seems incredible to me. So I advocate keeping human rights activism in its important place while calling on its audience to understand the need for a middle-class agenda alongside it. Now, those of us out in the audience do need to connect these two things, and because human rights activists won't succeed if the broader agenda fails. But that doesn't mean it's the responsibility of human rights movements to enact the broader agenda. And so my main answer is that we need to, in a way, in activist circles, in education, in law schools, in a way to focus less exclusively on the importance of human rights, as if a popular politics for a majority didn't ultimately create the conditions for human rights too. And so that's what I have in mind. It's vague, but I think it helps us move in a certain direction that we haven't explored adequately yet.
Okay, we apologize. We didn't take many questions on the chat, and the time is getting up. So, Jorge, do you have any other question, or do I continue with the questions on the chat?
Perhaps yes. There are like a couple of things that might be interesting to know. Some there. Women's rights, right? I think that that's important, and it appears in your book at some point. And I think that it's worth mentioning that also, because how do you think of how do women's rights appear in your book around these debates? Because there's also a discussion among feminism, women's rights.
Good. I actually can discuss that by returning to something I mentioned in passing, which was the campaign for status equality. And because we wouldn't want to neglect in talking about women's rights, also rights for those treated as racially inferior or the indigenous or disabled. And my basic idea is that those kinds of rights, women's rights and others' rights, like all rights, also turn out to be hostage to the larger political economy. We can imagine women's rights pursued by socialists, and in fact, most of the pioneering feminists in world history were socialist in the 19th and 20th centuries. But we can also imagine a neoliberal feminism. And in many countries, what we've seen is campaigns for women's rights that are divorced from concern for political economy. So the way you can put it, I think most challengingly, is as follows. In the neoliberal period in which we're living, on average, women have become more equal to men, by no means equal as a matter of status, but even distributionally, the average woman in many places is more equal in her income and wealth to the men in her society on average. But if we look at the relationship of rich women to the rest of women in the same time period, rich women have become less equal to the rest of women than before. So it's just to point out that that status equality can fit together with distributional inequality. And indeed, I think that's one of the main stories of our times. And I think it illustrates my worry about the human rights movement in general, if it really is hostage to this neoliberal age, because it's reflected one of our proper concerns with more status equality after millennia of patriarchy in the case of women. I think many, many people affiliate with human rights movements because belatedly human rights movements got associated with women's rights and the notion that women's rights are some of the most important human rights there are. But at the same time, these campaigns have, I think, very rarely done a lot to challenge distributional hierarchies, which have gotten worse rather than better. So the world is messy. And if I reduce this book to a formula, it's that it's not good and evil, but good and evil blend together. And some of our ways of pursuing good incur the risk of certain evils. And, if we recognize that, we can, I think, more adequately figure out what it might mean to pursue women's rights in an egalitarian spirit, not just with respect to status, but with respect to distribution.
Okay, we just have time for the last question, I guess, Professor Moyn. So some of the attendees say that how is cosmopolitanism and citizenship power related to this story in order to advance the human rights agenda? So any thoughts about that? Cosmopolitanism and the citizenship power.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a fascinating, debate that's skyrocketing in our time because people think that cosmopolitanism is being abandoned for nationalism. And there are significant philosophers like Martha Nussbaum who were once cosmopolitans who have embraced nationalism and said they were wrong in the 1990s. I think we have to be honest that cosmopolitanism has never gotten very far, even when it was going well, and it succeeded in forms that were weak and cheap. Here's what I mean. We learned to say that we care about all humans, but that didn't commit us to a lot more than identification. We didn't change migration rules beyond the extremely faulty regime we have that doesn't allow people to move, especially for economic reasons. And it didn't really change patterns of foreign aid. So, it was the cosmopolitanism of the 1990s really changed the world mostly in getting people to identify with the most atrocious kinds of sufferings that others experienced, like atrocity crimes. And sadly, those identifications often led to military interventions that made their beneficiaries worse off, like in Libya in 2011. So otherwise, cosmopolitanism never got that far. And I think we have to acknowledge that the world was always very nationalistic and not pretend that nationalism is new. And so if we believe, as I strongly do, that every child in the world matters as much as my own, morally, none is more precious than mine, but also none is less precious, then we have barely begun to kind of imagine a cosmopolitan world.
Thank you very much. Jorge, any final word? Because time is over, I guess so.
Other than thanking you, Sam, for this wonderful conversation, and Antonio and Eleonora for helping us organize this. We hope to have you, Sam, next year now in Bogota in the post-COVID world. And thank you, like everyone, all the participants, the 150 plus people that helped with us during our conversation. Thank you very much for coming here, especially people that were not from Bogota or associated with Universidad de los Andes, but even they participated and were here. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank both of you and especially the audience. And it's a pity that I'm not getting to visit, but I'm very easy to find online. So if we missed any questions, don't hesitate to write me and I'll write back as always.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much, Professor Moyn, and thank you, Jorge. Thank you all. Again, we apologize. We couldn't take all the questions on the chat, but we had a wonderful conversation here. So thank you very much, the two of you, and to every one of the audience. So I'll see you then.
Okay, next time.
Next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.